Detective Murphy had interviewed hundreds of suspects, but he'd never met anyone like the mall security guard. During a routine shoplifting investigation, the guard asked 3 simple questions that made the suspect confess to 6 other crimes, reveal his accomplice's location, and provide details about a drug operation the police hadn't even known existed. All within 5 minutes, using a voice so gentle it sounded like therapy. That's when Murphy realized this wasn't just good people skills. Welcome to Untold Valor Stories. Before we dive into this incredible tale of hidden psychological expertise and the power of the human mind, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the masters of human psychology who protect us in ways we never see. The Westfield Shopping Center employed 47 security guards across 3 shifts, but everyone agreed that Marcus Williams was different. Not because he was the biggest, at 5 feet 8 inches and 165 pounds, he was actually one of the smaller guards. Not because he was the most aggressive, Marcus had never raised his voice in 7 years on the job. He was different because he could make people talk. Store managers called him when they had difficult customers. Other guards called him when situations were escalating beyond their control. The mall administration called him when they needed someone to handle delicate situations that required more than standard security protocols. Marcus worked the evening shift, 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., which put him on duty during the busiest hours when teenagers gathered after school, families did their shopping, and most of the problems occurred. His beat included the food court, the main concourse, and the anchor stores where theft was most common. What made Marcus exceptional wasn't his training. The mall security orientation was only 2 weeks long. It wasn't his equipment. He carried the same radio, flashlight, and basic gear as every other guard. It was his ability to read people with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. Marcus could spot shoplifters before they stole anything, identify domestic violence situations before they escalated, and somehow convince troubled teenagers to call their parents instead of running away from home. His incident reports were legendary among mall management, detailed psychological assessments that read more like FBI behavioral profiles than security summaries. But Marcus's most remarkable talent was getting people to tell him things they'd never intended to share. Shoplifters didn't just admit to taking merchandise, they confessed to other thefts, explained their financial problems, and often provided information about accomplices and fencing operations. Teenagers caught smoking in the bathroom didn't just apologize, they talked about problems at home, drug use, and plans that worried Marcus enough to call their parents or school counselors. The other guards had theories about Marcus's abilities. Some thought he'd been a counselor or therapist before working security. Others suspected he had a psychology degree. A few believed he was just naturally gifted at reading people and making them comfortable enough to open up. What none of them knew was that Marcus had spent 12 years in the Army, the last 8 as a psychological operations specialist with the 4th Military Information Support Group. His job had been to understand how human minds worked under stress, how to extract information from uncooperative sources, and how to influence behavior through carefully constructed psychological techniques. Marcus had been trained by the Army to be a weapon that looked like a conversation. His cover story was simple and believable. He'd served in the military as a logistics specialist, had been medically discharged after a back injury, and needed work that wasn't physically demanding. The story satisfied background checks and explained his disciplined work habits without revealing that his logistics had involved managing the psychological warfare campaigns that supported special operations missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. Marcus had chosen security work specifically because it provided regular opportunities to practice the skills that had kept him alive overseas while serving a community that he'd grown to genuinely care about. Every shift was training, reading body language, assessing threat levels, building rapport with potential sources, and managing crisis situations using psychology instead of force. For 7 years, Marcus had successfully maintained this double life. To the Westfield Shopping Center, he was the security guard who was really good with people. To the dozens of teenagers he'd helped, the families he'd protected, and the criminals he'd caught, he was just a nice man who somehow understood their problems better than most counselors. But maintaining perfect operational security for 7 years required constant vigilance and careful management of the psychological techniques that made him so effective. Marcus had to be good enough to solve problems without being so good that people asked uncomfortable questions about his background, until Detective Murphy walked into his life with a shoplifting case that would change everything. Tuesday afternoon, November 8th, started routinely for Marcus. The after-school crowd was beginning to arrive, groups of teenagers with too much time and too little supervision, drawn to the mall by warmth, Wi-Fi, and the kind of social opportunities that parents didn't always approve of. At 4:23 p.m., Marcus received a radio call from Jennifer at Spencer's Gifts. Security to Spencer's, possible theft in progress. Marcus arrived to find Jennifer watching a young man, maybe 19 years old, who was browsing the novelty items near the back of the store with the kind of casual interest that experienced security guards recognized as performance behavior. "He's been here 20 minutes, Jennifer whispered to Marcus. "Keeps looking around, touching things but not really shopping. Classic signs." Marcus observed the suspect for 5 minutes, noting details that most security guards wouldn't catch. The young man's behavior wasn't just nervous, it was methodical. He was assessing store layout, camera positions, and staff locations with the systematic attention of someone who'd done this before. More concerning, Marcus noticed indicators that suggested the theft was part of a larger operation. The suspect was wearing clothes designed for concealment, carrying a bag modified for shoplifting, and checking his phone in patterns that suggested coordination with others. At 4:31 p.m., the suspect palmed a small item and headed toward the exit. Marcus intercepted him just outside the store with the standard approach that mall security used for theft cases. "Excuse me, sir. I'm Marcus with mall security. I need to speak with you about an item you may have forgotten to pay for." The suspect's response was immediate and well-rehearsed: denial, indignation, and demands to leave. Marcus had seen this performance hundreds of times from shoplifters who'd been coached on how to handle security confrontations, but instead of following standard security protocols, Marcus shifted into the psychological mode that had been his specialty in the army. "I understand this is stressful," Marcus said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had been developed through years of extracting information from uncooperative sources. "Nobody wants to be accused of something, especially when there might be misunderstandings about what happened." The suspect's defensive posture didn't change, but Marcus noticed micro-expressions that indicated the young man was processing more than just the immediate accusation. There was guilt, but also fear that seemed disproportionate to a simple shoplifting charge. Marcus made a decision that would reveal more about his background than 7 years of careful cover maintenance. He was going to use advanced interrogation techniques to find out what they were really dealing with. "What I'm curious about," Marcus continued, "is whether this is about the item you took from Spencer's, or if there's something else that's got you worried." The question was precisely calibrated. It acknowledged the theft without demanding immediate confession, while opening the door for the suspect to reveal additional concerns that might be motivating his behavior. The suspect's response indicated that Marcus's assessment had been accurate. "I don't know what you're talking about." "That's okay," Marcus replied. "Sometimes people do things when they're under pressure, financial stress, family problems, stuff that makes normal solutions seem impossible. The item itself isn't really the issue. The question is whether you're getting the help you need with whatever's really going on." Marcus was using a technique called emotional labeling, identifying and verbalizing the emotions that were driving the suspect's behavior. It was a method designed to build rapport and encourage disclosure by demonstrating understanding rather than judgment. The effect was immediate. The suspect's defensive posture began to soften, and Marcus could see the psychological calculation shifting from "how do I escape" to "maybe this person understands." "It's not about the money," the suspect said quietly. Marcus had achieved the first breakthrough. The suspect had moved from denial to partial acknowledgement, and was beginning to provide emotional context for his behavior. Now Marcus needed to build on that foundation to extract the information that would determine how to handle the situation. "Tell me about the pressure you're under," Marcus said, using the gentle tone that encouraged disclosure while maintaining the authority that prevented the suspect from feeling like he could lie or manipulate the conversation. What happened next was exactly what Detective Murphy would witness when he arrived to handle what everyone thought was a routine shoplifting case. Detective Murphy arrived at Westfield Shopping Center expecting to process a standard retail theft case, take a statement, collect evidence, write a report, and move on to more serious crimes. But when he found the suspect sitting calmly in the security office, talking to the mall guard like they were old friends, Murphy knew something unusual was happening. "He's been telling me about his situation," Marcus explained to Murphy as they stepped aside for a brief conference. "This isn't just shoplifting. There's a larger operation involving multiple people and multiple stores." Murphy looked at the young man, who appeared relaxed despite being caught stealing and facing criminal charges. "How much has he told you?" "Enough that I think you're going to want to hear the full story. But I should warn you, what he's describing is bigger than retail theft." Murphy returned to the security office and introduced himself to the suspect, expecting to encounter the usual hostility and legal demands that complicated most theft investigations. Instead, the young man looked up with an expression that was somewhere between relief and resignation. "Officer, I need to tell you some things," the suspect said. "Marcus helped me understand that I'm in over my head, and I need to get out before someone gets hurt." Murphy glanced at Marcus with confusion. In 15 years of police work, he'd never had a suspect volunteer to confess to additional crimes before being questioned. "Why don't you start by telling me your name?" Murphy said, settling into the chair across from the suspect. "Derek Thompson. And I want to be clear, I did steal from Spencer's, but that's not why I'm really scared." Over the next hour, Derek provided a confession that exceeded anything Murphy had encountered in his career. Not just because of the scope of what Derek revealed, but because of the way the information was extracted through what appeared to be casual conversation guided by the mall security guard. Marcus asked 3 specific questions that unlocked Derek's entire criminal involvement. "Derek, when you took that item from Spencer's, you kept checking your phone. Were you supposed to report back to someone?" This question revealed that Derek was part of an organized retail theft ring involving 6 people who targeted multiple malls across the state. "The people you're working with, are they the kind of people who get violent when operations don't go according to plan?" This question uncovered Derek's real fear. His criminal associates had threatened violence against his younger sister if he failed to meet theft quotas or if he got caught and cooperated with police. "What would need to happen for you to feel safe enough to help us stop these people before they hurt your sister or someone else?" This question transformed Derek from reluctant suspect to active informant, providing detailed information about the theft ring's organization, methods, and planned operations. By 6:15 p.m., Derek had provided intelligence that would lead to arrests of 6 people involved in organized retail theft, the recovery of over $50,000 in stolen merchandise, and the disruption of an operation that had been targeting stores across 3 counties. But what impressed Murphy most wasn't the scope of Derek's confession, it was the psychological skill that Marcus had demonstrated in extracting the information. "I've never seen anything like that," Murphy told Marcus as they watched Derek being transported for booking. "How did you know what questions to ask?" Marcus had been expecting this conversation for 7 years, but he still wasn't prepared for the decision he had to make about how much to reveal about his background. "I spent some time in the military," Marcus said carefully. "Learned some techniques for getting people to talk about things they're reluctant to discuss." "What kind of military work teaches those techniques?" Marcus looked at Detective Murphy, assessing his trustworthiness and calculating the risks of partial disclosure. "The kind that requires security clearances that I can't really discuss in detail." Murphy understood that he was being given a carefully constructed answer that revealed some truth while protecting classified information. "How long were you in?" 12 years. Psychological operations specialist. "And now you work mall security?" Marcus's answer revealed the complexity of transitioning from military psychological warfare to civilian life. Turns out the skills transfer really well to helping people solve problems before they become crimes. Detective Murphy spent the next week following up on the intelligence that Derek Thompson had provided, and with each arrest and recovered piece of evidence, his appreciation for Marcus's psychological expertise grew. The retail theft ring had been more sophisticated than typical shoplifting operations. They used social media to coordinate targets, employed different people for theft and fencing operations, and had been careful to avoid patterns that would attract law enforcement attention. But Derek's confession had provided a roadmap that allowed Murphy to dismantle the entire network. More importantly, Derek's cooperation had been motivated not by legal pressure but by genuine concern for his sister's safety, exactly the kind of emotional motivation that Marcus had identified and leveraged during their conversation. Murphy began researching psychological operations training to understand what kind of background could produce Marcus's level of expertise. What he discovered was both impressive and concerning. Military psychological operations specialists were trained to understand human behavior at a level that bordered on manipulation. They learned to read microexpressions, identify emotional vulnerabilities, and construct conversations that would extract information or influence behavior without the target realizing they were being psychologically managed. The training was designed for situations where American forces needed to gather intelligence from hostile populations, recruit assets in enemy territory, or influence behavior in ways that supported military objectives. It was sophisticated, effective, and potentially dangerous if used inappropriately. Murphy also discovered that psychological operations specialists often struggled with civilian transitions because their skills were difficult to apply in normal careers without raising questions about their backgrounds. A week after Derek's arrest, Murphy returned to Westfield Shopping Center to continue a conversation that had been interrupted by the investigation. "I've been thinking about our talk," Murphy told Marcus during a quiet moment in the security office. "Your background, the techniques you used with Derek, that's not standard military training." "No, it's not." "How advanced is your training? In psychological manipulation?" Marcus's answer was careful but honest. Advanced enough that I have to be very careful about how I use it in civilian situations. Have you been using those techniques on other people here at the mall? Every day. But for their benefit, not against them. Murphy realized that Marcus was describing a fundamental ethical choice about how to use potentially dangerous skills. Can you give me an example? Marcus told Murphy about a teenager he'd encountered the previous month who'd been exhibiting behavioral indicators that suggested suicidal ideation. Using psychological assessment techniques, Marcus had identified the warning signs, built rapport with the teenager, and guided him toward calling a crisis hotline that had likely saved his life. The parents never knew their son was in crisis, Marcus explained. The school counselors hadn't recognized the signs. But the techniques I learned in the Army allowed me to identify the problem and intervene before it became a tragedy. Murphy began to understand that Marcus had found a way to use military psychological training for community protection rather than intelligence gathering or behavior manipulation. How often do you encounter situations that require that level of intervention? More often than you might think. Domestic violence, drug abuse, family crisis, mental health emergencies. People come to malls when they're struggling, and sometimes a security guard is the first person who notices they need help. Murphy made a decision that would change both their careers. Would you be interested in working with the police department? Not as an officer, but as a consultant on cases that require psychological expertise. Marcus had been expecting this question since the Derek Thompson investigation. What kind of cases? Interview assistance, crisis negotiation, behavioral analysis. Situations where your background might help us solve problems before they become tragedies. Asterisk. 6 months after Detective Murphy first witnessed Marcus's psychological expertise, their collaboration had evolved into one of the most effective crime prevention partnerships the Hartford Police Department had ever developed, Marcus continued. Working mall security, but he also provided consultation on police cases that required understanding of human behavior, crisis intervention, or specialized interview techniques. His contributions had helped solve cases that might otherwise have remained unsolved and prevented situations that could have escalated into violence. The partnership operated under strict guidelines that protected both Marcus's cover identity and the ethical use of his psychological training. Marcus never participated in interrogations of suspects who'd requested lawyers, never used his skills for prosecutorial advantage, and focused exclusively on public safety applications of his expertise. The results had been remarkable. Marcus had helped identify domestic violence situations before they became homicides, assisted with suicide interventions that had saved lives, and provided behavioral analysis that had helped locate missing persons and prevent planned violence. But the most important outcome of the partnership was the training program they'd developed for other law enforcement officers. Marcus began teaching crisis intervention techniques to police officers, security guards, and emergency responders who needed to understand how psychological stress affected behavior and how to de-escalate situations through communication rather than force. The techniques we use aren't manipulation, Marcus explained to a class of police officers during one of his training sessions. They're communication tools that help people feel understood so they can make better decisions about their own behavior. The training program had attracted attention from federal agencies that were interested in Marcus's unique combination of military psychological operations experience and civilian crisis intervention applications. 6 months after beginning his collaboration with Detective Murphy, Marcus received a call from FBI agent Sarah Chen, who was recruiting consultants for the Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Your reputation for crisis intervention and behavioral assessment has reached federal attention, Agent Chen told Marcus during their initial meeting. We're developing a program that uses psychological techniques for community policing and crisis prevention. Marcus was interested but cautious about expanding his involvement with law enforcement agencies. What kind of program? Training law enforcement officers to recognize behavioral indicators of planned violence, crisis intervention techniques that prevent situations from escalating, and community engagement strategies that build trust through understanding rather than authority. Agent Chen explained that the FBI had recognized the need for more sophisticated psychological approaches to community policing, especially in situations involving mental health crises, domestic violence, and prevention of mass violence events. Your background gives you credibility with both military veterans and civilian populations, Agent Chen continued. Your techniques have proven effective for crisis resolution without compromising civil liberties or individual rights. Marcus made a decision that surprised him. For 7 years, he'd avoided any involvement that might expose his psychological operations background. But the opportunity to use his training for community protection on a larger scale was exactly the kind of meaningful work he'd been hoping to find. I'm interested. But I have conditions. What kind of conditions? Complete transparency about how the techniques are used. No applications that manipulate people for prosecutorial advantage. Focus exclusively on public safety and crisis prevention. Agent Chen agreed to Marcus's conditions, and within 3 months, he was traveling across the country training law enforcement officers in psychological techniques for community protection. 2 years after Detective Murphy first witnessed Marcus's psychological expertise, the principles they developed together had been implemented by law enforcement agencies across the United States. Marcus continued working part-time mall security, not because he needed the job, but because it provided ongoing opportunities to practice community-focused applications of his psychological training. But his primary work had evolved into something larger, teaching other people how to use understanding of human behavior for protection rather than manipulation. The training programs Marcus developed were being used by police departments, crisis intervention teams, school counselors, and security professionals who needed to understand how psychological stress affected behavior and how to help people make better decisions through communication rather than coercion. The techniques we learned in the military were designed for intelligence gathering and behavior modification, Marcus told a conference of police chiefs during one of his presentations. But the same understanding of human psychology can be used to help people solve problems, avoid crisis situations, and find resources they need to improve their lives. Marcus had discovered that the most effective way to use psychological operations training in civilian life was to focus on empowering people rather than controlling them. Instead of extracting information for intelligence purposes, he used communication techniques to help people express their needs and concerns. Instead of manipulating behavior for strategic advantage, he helped people understand their own motivations and make informed decisions. The partnership with Detective Murphy continued to be productive, but it had also inspired similar collaborations between military veterans with specialized training and civilian law enforcement agencies that needed their expertise. Some days I prevent crimes by helping people solve problems before they become desperate, Marcus told Murphy during one of their regular coordination meetings. Some days I help police officers understand why people behave the way they do under stress. Every day, I use training that was designed for warfare to help communities stay peaceful. Detective Murphy had learned to appreciate both Marcus's expertise and his ethical approach to using potentially dangerous skills. Do you ever miss the military applications of your training? Marcus looked around the mall, where teenagers were studying together, families were shopping peacefully, and elderly people were walking for exercise in climate-controlled comfort. I thought leaving the army meant giving up the opportunity to serve my country. Instead, I discovered that protecting communities is the most direct way to serve the country I fought for. The Westfield Shopping Center remained exactly what it appeared to be, a retail complex where people came to shop, eat, and socialize. But it was also something more, a place where someone with advanced understanding of human psychology used his training to protect people who never knew they needed protection. Marcus had found peace not by abandoning his military training, but by transforming it into something that served the communities he'd learned to call home. His story proved that the most effective warriors could become the most effective protectors, using knowledge of human nature to help people rather than control them. And in conference rooms across America, law enforcement officers were learning that sometimes the best way to fight crime was to understand why people committed crimes in the first place, and to help them find better solutions before desperation drove them toward violence.